I will co-chair today's session. We have 10:03 in Moscow and 9:03 in Brussels and Geneva as they join us online. Our session is also being broadcasted directly by YouTube. We will work in English today because of some problems which we have with one of international conference service providers, but also because we have a lot of foreign guests today. Those who want to listen to Russian interpretation should switch to another system as described in the instruction you have received. For your questions to speakers, please use the chat. You also may put your questions in English or Russian. And that's about housekeeping. Now on substance. Dear colleagues, when we met last year, also in online format, there were a lot of uncertainties around. Substantial part of that uncertainties was caused by pandemic and its immediate and long-term consequences, both for economies and employment, and also for trade. Forecasts, I remember that perfectly, were very pessimistic. And for those who deals with trade, main question was whether countries will close their borders together with their economies in order to survive on their own. And what will be the future of the WTO, already battered by that time by many other developments. Today's situation seems to be somewhat more stable. Majority confirmed that multilateral cooperation is necessary to safeguard trade and participating economies. However, as usual, there are different views on how WTO and trade rules should develop in order to secure interests of its members and of the whole trading world. So today we have a very good possibility to discuss all these issues with those people who are directly involved in development of national and multilateral trade policies and trade negotiations in and outside the WTO. Each of our panelists today works in international trade policy for more than 20 years. So cumulatively, it's more than 100 years if we take all four panelists' experience together. And certainly they belong, all of them, to a small group of international trade decision makers. Our first speaker today will be Ambassador Didier Chambouvet, permanent representative of Switzerland to the WTO. He will address the issue which for many of us, unfortunately, also for our families, will continue to be vital. It's access to medicines. Pandemic demonstrated here and there necessity to keep trade in goods and services for public health open. And the question is, could WTO do something here? Please, Didier.
Thank you very much, Max. Thank you for your introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank the Higher School of Economics for the invitation to their International Academic Conference. And in particular, I would like to thank Maxim Medvedkov who set up the session on New Horizon of International Trade Regulation. As you rightly said, Max, the pandemic and trade is an issue that is intensely debated, in particular in the context of the World Trade Organization. Trade and health and the contribution that trade regulations can make to secure the timely supply of essential goods in the context of a global health crisis is a very important issue. The COVID-19 crisis has created unprecedented challenges for WTO members. Insufficient supplies and disruptions in the supply chains cut off for longer or shorter periods a large number of people from the necessary medical goods. Addressing the COVID-19 pandemic required to ensure the development as well as an equitable and affordable access to essential medical goods. In simple terms, global supply must meet global demand for medical products, and trade plays a critical role in this context. The crisis provides an opportunity for WTO members to consider how the trade policy toolbox can be strengthened to increase supply and improve preparedness for future pandemics. In March last year, when the pandemic began to strike, many countries or WTO members responded to the crisis in an uncoordinated way with unilateral export restrictive measures for medical and essential goods. Following this first wave of trade restrictive measures, members started to initiate import facilitating measures. They implemented simpler and more efficient custom procedures and suspension of custom duties. We should draw lessons from recent experiences. The crisis clearly revealed the lack of coordination and cooperation between countries facing the same problems. In fact, trade facilitating policies by some were undermined by export restrictions by others. The lessons learned are straightforward. A global crisis requires a global response. To ensure the availability of medical and essential goods worldwide, we need to facilitate trade in such products. And to maximize the impact of such trade facilitation policies, WTO members need to coordinate their practices. Against this background, a number of WTO members joined together in the so-called Ottawa Group, decided to play a leading role in promoting a trade and health initiative at the WTO. They are proposing a number of commitments that WTO members would make to better deal with the crisis. And in the Ottawa Group, you have countries such as Australia, Brazil, Canada. You also have the European Union. Switzerland is there, also Japan and others. To start with, I would like to mention the commitments on export restrictions put forward by this group of countries. They can be summarized in 4 points. First, reviewing and eliminating promptly unnecessary export restrictions. Second, exercising restraint in the imposition of any new export restriction, and in doing so, ensuring that the interests of the most vulnerable countries with scarce manufacturing capacities are considered. Third, ensuring that trade measures do not disrupt the operation of the global COVAX facility for vaccine distribution. Fourth, ensuring that measures are targeted, transparent, proportionate, temporary, and consistent with WTO obligations. This is the ideal, and clearly you certainly have observed that we're far from this at the moment, and this is the reason why we are promoting the principles, and we hope that the situation will improve in the future. So this was for export restrictions. Let me turn now to other elements of the initiative. The initiative also proposes to share experiences and to establish best practices and cooperation in the implementation of customs, services, and technical regulations. For example, relaxing import licensing requirements introducing fast-track facilities for goods clearance at customs, expediting air or maritime cargo. Furthermore, the initiative insists on the need to ensure greater transparency of trade measures. Transparency is key to increase the legal certainty for trading operators. In this sense, providing the WTO with timely notifications will allow members to engage in finding solutions to possible trade disruptions. In addition, the initiative forces that members would make best efforts to remove or reduce tariffs during the crisis. And finally, the initiative calls for enhanced cooperation between the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and other relevant international organizations, including the World Health Organization and the World Customs Organization. This initiative has already been presented at the WTO, and proponents are currently reaching out to other WTO members. And we hope that many other co-sponsors will join, since the impact of the Trade and Health Initiative will very much depend on the level of support from WTO members. The engagement of the largest trading nations is critical. The idea is to make a decision on these issues at the next ministerial meeting that will take place at the end of November this year. We are mindful, though, that the talks in various configurations may take a different speed, and the outcome of such discussions may not necessarily produce a multilateral result. We are, for instance, well aware of sensitivities on tariffs. These were my remarks on the initiative by this group of countries called the Ottawa Group, that is coordinated by Canada. Let me now share some personal thoughts about the issue of intellectual property and the so-called TRIPS waiver. In October 2020, South Africa and India submitted a proposal to the WTO requesting that countries be allowed to waive certain IP rights until the majority of the world population receives effective vaccines and develops immunity to COVID-19. Those intellectual property rights are currently protected by the relevant WTO agreement on trade-related intellectual property rights, in short, the TRIPS agreement. The abbreviation is TRIPS. And therefore, we call this proposal by South Africa and India the TRIPS waiver. If granted, the proposed waiver, TRIPS waiver, would mean the suspension of patent rights, industrial designs, trade secrets, and copyright on everything related to the pandemic, including not only vaccines and medicines, but also medicinal products such as tests and ventilators. The proponents argue that the suspension of patent protection, for instance, would facilitate technology transfer and boost production worldwide. The idea is that the originator, that is, the inventor, the developer, and the patent holder, would no longer enjoy exclusive marketing rights. Its invention could be replicated or copied by any pharmaceutical company without restrictions. The question is this so simple? Is it the right response to the challenges we are facing? From my perspective, the answer is clearly no. The proposed waiver would rather be counterproductive, and I will explain why. In my remarks, I will primarily dwell on the most needed essential good, namely vaccines. Let me say at the outset that the common goal must be and is to work towards global access to COVID-19 vaccines as expeditiously as possible. With the first few vaccines obtaining regulatory approval only at the turn of the year, we are still far from having enough vaccines to vaccinate the world population. The considerable efforts underway to scale up global manufacturing need time to bear fruit. Would the proposed TRIPS waiver be helpful or harmful to these efforts? To answer this question, I would like to recall that the COVID-19 vaccines are complex biotechnological products. Those based on the novel messenger RNA technology involve completely new manufacturing processes. Their production requires the setup of new manufacturing facilities or extensive repurposing of existing ones. This is time and resource consuming. It requires cooperation between a variety of different public and private actors, a functioning market for risk capital, as well as a predictable framework on the rights and obligations relating to the research results. The TRIPS agreement of the WTO offers this framework. Patent protection ensures that sufficient risk capital flows into research and development, and that there is clarity about rights and obligations relating to the research results. This encourages companies to invest in new innovative health technologies, and to establish partnerships with foundations, universities, and state actors so that new effective vaccines and medicines against the COVID-19 can be developed jointly. COVID-19 will not be the last pandemic. In the current situation, if we signal that intellectual property rights will simply be suspended in the event of a crisis, this will discourage companies from investing in research and development activities to respond to future health crises. To scale up production capacities as rapidly and safely as possible, contractual manufacturing is a more promising approach, meaning a close partnership between vaccine developers and manufacturers which have the technological production capacity and the capability to ensure the quality and safety of their products. Intellectual property rights, and in particular patent, stimulate stakeholders' interaction. These instruments create the trust that stakeholders need to share sensitive information, knowledge, and data, and to license in and out technology. Thanks to intellectual property protection, companies know that sharing technology will not be detrimental to their interest. This would not any longer be the case if the proposed TRIPS waivers would be implemented. Suspending intellectual property rights and patent protection for COVID-19 related technologies would mean to undermine the foundation of a large part of the efforts and investments which brought about impressive results in the search for a cure against the coronavirus. Let me recall that in less than 1 year, we have not just one, but many safe and highly effective vaccines. This is more than 3 years faster than the fastest ever developed vaccine in the past. Now, the name of the game is increasing production to meet global demand. More than 200 collaboration partnerships have already been established with a view to jointly speeding up manufacturing. AstraZeneca, for example, collaborates with manufacturing partners in Argentina, Brazil, China, India, Korea, Mexico, and Russia. These and other partnerships, and the many other partnerships, are built on the international regulatory framework, including the WTO TRIPS agreement. The positive results on global supply of these manufacturing partnerships will start to show, notably over the coming weeks and months. The pharmaceutical industry is projecting that 10 billion doses of COVID-19 vaccine will be produced in 2021, and this will allow to vaccinate a significant percentage of the world population. But it remains that we're not there yet. The unprecedented challenge to provide the whole world population with novel vaccines cannot be mastered simply by snapping your fingers. All initiatives which brings together vaccine developers with manufacturers with relevant manufacturing capacity should be welcome and encouraged. What is required to scale up capacities is a strategic use of resources and supply chains while ensuring the close cooperation of all stakeholders, private and public. Thank you very much for your attention. And of course, I am open to answer any question. Max, you said that questions can be asked in the chat. Of course, I will only be able to understand question asked in English, and you will certainly help me if a question is drafted in Russian.
Yes, thank you very much, Ambassador. It was extremely interesting story, and we hope that in this specific case, WTO negotiations will not last too long, because it's really vital. The results are vital for population of many countries. We have a question to you, and probably I will read it. It's in English. Ambassador Shambhavi, thank you for your presentation. If I may, I would like to ask one question. You mentioned enhanced transparency requirements for export restrictions as one of the ways to improve the current system of rules. In your view, what could be potential parameters of the new transparency disciplines on export restrictions, and whether, in your opinion, any concrete results could already be achieved by MC12? Thank you. Pauline Tonkik from WTO Expertise Center.
Thank you very much. This is a good question, and we have in the Ottawa Group initiatives already provided some indication of what the additional commitments and the expedited procedures could be. I think what is important is, first of all, that the notification is timely. Very often, notifications are coming too late. So they should come as quickly as possible. This is something that is important. Second, there should be in the notification an explanation why the measure is being implemented, so that there is a possibility for other countries to have a discussion with the country which would like to implement these restrictions can take place. And lastly, I think what is important in increasing transparency is also dispelling some misunderstanding on the state of supply. And it may well be that if we increase the availability of information along the supply chain, this will perhaps raise the comfort of some countries which are afraid of being faced with shortages. And if we know that there are stocks and that those stocks can be shipped, this could help, of course, countries and allay their fears, so that they are not going to resort to export restriction. Export restriction should really be the last resort. Now, do I expect result for the next ministerial meeting? It's a question that is difficult to answer at this very moment, because the initiator of these proposals are currently reaching out to other members, and we hope to be able to muster as much support as we can until the next ministerial meeting. The objective clearly is to make a decision and on this initiative, and in particular on some important aspects of these initiatives, and transparency is one of those aspects.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And another question which I received by WhatsApp for whatever reason,
okay,
is I will translate from Russian. Ambassador, could you please explain whether position of some governments aimed at restriction of importation and on production of enough domestic medicines and other health material is in line with members' thinking in respect of future WTO rules?
So you speak about the fact that countries are striving for autonomy. Is it
right?
Is it how I should understand the question? And the question is whether this is in line with future WTO rules. Okay, I mean, first of all, we have to see whether this is in line with current rules. Of course, when you're facing a special situation, such as a health crisis, there are general exceptions under the WTO agreements, in particular for trading goods, but also for trading services, that would allow countries to impose restrictions. The issue is really whether this is the right policy. So we have the legal aspects is one thing, but then we have to look at the impact of the measure and to ask ourselves the question of the opportunity of such a policy. And experience has shown that this kind of health nationalism is counterproductive. It's counterproductive because we do not manage to mobilize all the resources. It's counterproductive also because most medicinal products, be they vaccines, respirators, or other kind of therapies, are now manufactured in the context of global supply chains. There are inputs coming from different parts of the world that are being put together at one place. And if the production is organized this way, it is because this is the most efficient way of organizing production. So this is the best way to maximize the quality and the quantity of production, to manufacture those products in the context of global supply chain. And this is, of course, what has been done, even for vaccines. For vaccines, you need a number of ingredients to make a vaccine. And these ingredients cannot be produced in one single country. There is no single country on earth that is able to manufacture a vaccine along the entire production process. That's impossible. So any country would have to import components or inputs. So now, this is one thing. The other thing is that, of course, there has been shortages, there has been export restrictions, there has been problems, and it's, in a sense, understandable that a number of countries are afraid of the consequences of this kind of trade measures, and that's the reason why there was a tendency, to develop the national production and to protect national productions against outside competition from outside, and also to block exports. And I think that in the context of the initiative of the Ottawa Group, this initiative on facilitating trade, what we would like to do is to create trust so that countries are not fretting, they're not panicking, and that they're looking at the situation rationally, to take stock of where we're standing, to take stock where the stocks are. And if we implement the principle of this initiative, of course, there should be less trade restrictions. So if there are less trade restrictions, I think probably the incentive to resort to health nationalism or vaccine nationalism will diminish, because there will be some guarantee that the supply of essential goods will be guaranteed. That's the philosophy behind this.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for this replies, and we really wish good luck to all negotiators and to you, who is discussing the future deals in this very important sphere. Dear colleagues, our next speaker, I suggest, will be Madeleine Tuninger, because she just told me she has some urgent commitment and she wanted to be second in our session. If you don't mind, I will give the floor to Madeleine. Madeleine is head of Trade and Sustainable Development Unit in DG Trade of European Commission. She is directly involved in developing of environmental measures in European Union in the context of multilateral trading system. The famous Green Deal and how it will be incorporated in WTO and other measures which the government will take in the sphere of environment, as I understand, the sphere of Madeleine's competence. And I invite her to present a view in respect on how WTO agreements may accumulate new challenges connected with national environmental policies. Please, Madeleine.
Microphone, sorry. Your mic is off,
yes,
sorry.
I'm mute. Thank you very much, Maxine, for this introduction. Thanks also to the London School of Economics for organizing this. And it is a particular pleasure to be here in this distinguished panel, in particular with Maxine, Mia Katarina, and Dimitri. We go back to the early 2000s when we negotiated Russia's accession to the WTO. Which was an intense process with many meetings, not only in Geneva, but also in St. Petersburg, and I remember even Nizhny Novgorod. So great to see you all, has been some time. Now, turning to the topic of my intervention, the situation is indeed changing, and certainly if we go back, if we compare to the time that Russia joined the WTO, environment and climate clearly have accelerated to, I would nearly say, the center. An acute awareness and desire to act in multiple green fields, climate action, biodiversity, pollution, etc. And in all these areas, we are at very crucial moments to step up our ambitions. There are at least 2 COPs this year for climate and for biodiversity. Now, within all of this, trade has an important role to say. It's very basic. We send and buy products from and to other countries, and the same goes with services. Today, we increasingly not only look at whether the product that we get is safe or does not harm our health, but we also want to know whether that product was made with a lot of CO2 emissions or whether it led to deforestation or loss of biodiversity. These are conditions linked to the method with which the product was made. Trade is, in very simple terms, affected at various levels by environmental consideration within the WTO itself, and I will say a bit more about it. The link to the MEAs, the multilateral environmental agreements, and of course, domestic measures, because there we implement these international commitments. Now, what is in the WTO? Well, first of all, it is not new. The WTO agreement fully recognizes the importance of preserving the environment. This is clear already from the preamble of the Marrakesh Agreement establishing the WTO and also from the WTO jurisprudence. In the preamble, the WTO members recognize that their trade relations should be conducted with a view to expand trade in goods and services, while at the same time seeking both to protect and preserve the environment. The placement of the environmental objectives in the preamble next to trade objectives signals that the agreement does not intend to establish a hierarchy between trade and environment, which is confirmed also by WTO jurisprudence. Now, turning more to the WTO and sort of the where it comes up, a few examples. Actually, environment plays a role throughout the various functions of the WTO. To give you a few examples, go to the WTO agreement on technical barriers to trade. There's many environmental standards indeed, and they need to comply with the requirements of the WTO TBT agreement. Another example where at this moment there are plurilateral negotiations is subsidies on fish. or where we've tried in the past to negotiate an agreement on involving tariffs on environmental friendly goods. The objective of that was to give the trade contribution to climate. Likewise for services, and there's a revival of discussions on liberalization or possible liberalization of services, environmental friendly services. Now, all of these areas have their complexity because you get into the definition, what is an environmental friendly good, what is an environmental friendly service. But there's a strong focus of environment within these discussions. Of course, there's a committee, the Committee on Trade and Environment, which is a platform where we have multilateral discussions on trade and environment. Within the agreements, let's not forget key provisions with which any domestic measure has to comply, which is GATT Articles 1, MFN, 3, non-discrimination, and 11, for example, export restrictions or import measures. And then Article 20 GATT gives the rules under which apply for general exceptions. And you have a similar one for services. I'll get back to these domestic measures. Now, is there a link with multilateral environment agreements? For me, it is obvious, but it is not obvious because if we look at the discussions in the WTO, it's not always easy to formally make these linkages. We do have interinstitutional discussions. And that comes forward in the relevant Committee on Trade and Environment, where we regularly have analytical and policy exchanges on multilateral environment agreements and updates on where they are. Now, two points to highlight. There are some MEAs, multilateral environment agreements, that actually have direct trade provisions. Look, for example, at bans on trade in the Basel Convention or CITES. CITES, the wildlife trafficking. And of course, as we step up action and commitments in international environmental fora, these will often include commitments that need to be translated these need to translate international ambitions into domestic actions. Take Paris. There are over 6,000 climate measures taken at national level that have been notified. And these measures need to comply with WTO requirements. Beyond climate, there's also new action now in the making among supporters. Several countries are discussing the possible negotiation of an international plastics agreement. There are also clear trade dimension to that, and it's important that the trade community is involved to make sure that that's also compatible with trade. Now, is there some sort of hierarchy then between multilateral environment agreements and the WTO? No, I think, as I said in my, well, that would lead to the question. So if there is, imagine that there is a legal conflict between the commitments and measures to implement Paris and solutions that can be found so that the latter can more easily prevail over the former. Now, first of all, trade and climate policies are fully compatible. Both WTO and also FTAs, free trade agreements rules, give considerable latitude to countries to adopt measures to protect global environment and climate. They do not put trade above or against environmental objectives. As I said, both the jurisprudence and the preamble of the WTO recognize this. So neither the WTO rules nor the rules in free trade agreements prevent countries from implementing commitments under the Paris Agreement. And as you know, the Commission priorities now to fight against climate change are clear. And we think that we can do that in a manner that is compatible with what we do. And that brings me to my third point is, so what do we do and how do we look at the domestic measures? Now, how do you make that legal? It is perfectly possible to make measures legal under the WTO in a non-discriminatory way to tackle, for example, climate change. And the principle is also recognized in Article 20 of the GATT for trading goods and 14 for GATT. These general exception provisions allow WTO members to justify discriminatory measures on the basis of policy grounds, specific policy grounds. Hence, recourse to the provisions requires that the measure is found to be inconsistent with an obligation or under GATT or GATS. Otherwise, you don't need an exception. Article 20 provides that nothing in this agreement shall be construed to prevent the adoption or enforcement by any contracting partner. And then you come to letter B, necessary to protect human, animal, plant life or health. And letter G, relating to the conservation of exhaustible natural resources if such measures are made effective in conjunction with restrictions on domestic production or consumption. Long sentence, a lot of jurisprudence around it. The possibility to rely on these grounds is, however, subject to the requirement that these measures are not applied in a manner which would constitute a means of arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination between the countries where the same conditions prevail or a disguised restriction on international trade. This is the so-called chapeau. And also on this, there's a lot of jurisprudence. Let's take an example. We go to carbon border adjustment, the CBAM, carbon border adjustment mechanisms, which I know that happens to be on the in the mind of many. So the EU Green Deal announced a CBAM for selected economic sectors as part of a series of initiatives aimed at reducing carbon footprint and ensuring that the EU becomes climate neutral by 2050. The CBAM is a climate protection measure which is necessary in view of the persisting difference between countries' level of ambition in protecting climate as opposed to the increased climate ambition of the EU. And we are currently conducting an assessment and an analysis that aims to put a legislative proposal in the first half of 2021 on the table. And there are certain aspects in the design of the measure that we are looking now, whether that will be a carbon tax or a new tax on imports or an extension of what we have, the so-called ETS emission trading system. Now, different rules of the WTO come into play, depending on the design of the measures. These include rules that prevent discrimination. So the first step that you need to do is, can I make a measure in a manner that is non-discriminatory and complies with Articles 1, the MFN principle, and Article 3, national treatment of the GATT. We think that CBAM can be designed in such a manner, both vis-à-vis domestic, so a non-discriminatory measure vis-à-vis foreign products, so that there would be no breach of the non-discrimination rules. But should that be inconsistent with the rules, it would need to be justified and under Article 20G and the corresponding chapeau. This would require taking into account a number of factors. For example, the measure. Is it a genuine climate protection objective? Or number two, is it even-handed? That means that is it made effective in conjunction with equivalent restrictions on domestic production and consumption? And the third is it not arbitrary or unjustifiably discriminatory between the EU and third countries, and between third countries amongst them, which may require taking into account countries' different levels of development in the light of the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. Now, a final word on the way ahead at this moment, to make it a little bit less legal, but this complexity, in my view, is really important. We have the Green Deal, but we are not the only ones that are taking green measures. It's clearly emerging across the globe. So we have an interest in looking into this and thinking about it before we are turning the Committee of Trade and Environment into a committee that is only digesting domestic measures without setting some frame. So from a broad perspective, a group of friends of environment in the WTO has set up last year, a process to discuss trade and environment in a more in-depth manner. They come together in the so-called TESSD discussions, which comes down to trade and environmental sustainability structured discussion. Structured discussion is a very boring terminology for important work. It is a group of reflection and a group of countries that said we want to dig deeper into a topic and possibly make proposals. And this group hopes to generate a broad group of supporters for action at the next ministerial conference of the WTO in December this year. Now, we are discussing what trade policy could or should do across the functions of the WTO, and this includes discussions on the role of trade in climate, biodiversity, circular economy, pollution, and so on. Within the overall efforts to move environment forward, the EU is exploring ideas for a specific climate initiative, and we hope to present something later before the summer. Now, our ideas include that we need to connect the dots in the WTO, and we need to look at several building blocks. We've highlighted a couple of them. Tariffs, what can we do further in tariffs? Services, same question. We put a lot of emphasis on the domestic measures and also the development dimension. Now, on domestic measures, there are two types we're looking at. We have the more subsidies part. The fossil fuel subsidies is a topic highly under discussion. Fossil fuels are a big contributor to CO2 emissions, if not the biggest. And domestic measures, people are taking a bit symbolically EU CBAM, but I think when people say EU CBAM, that there's many green measures, not only in the EU, but also elsewhere, in the making and in the reflection. Now, for us, I mean, we're still looking at this. We're developing our proposals, but the critical point is transparency. It starts with transparency. So we need to have a good understanding of the underlying environmental objectives. So we need to continue to discuss the interface in the WTO of what happens in the multilateral environment agreements, how that is translated domestically, and what that means for the WTO. And we need to encourage interactions, as I said, between the WTO and these multilateral environment agreements. We need to remain transparent in early stages of the design of the measures. So the EU has tried in the WTO, but also in the OECD, in bilateral fora, everywhere we go, we've tried to be transparent as we develop the Green Deal measures, which are not limited to climate. I think cut across all environmental fields. So that transparency and outreach is important. Discussions that are also important in the WTO, we think, is that we need to get a good understanding of what happens in the supply chain. Normally, when a good comes at your border, it has passed several stages of processing, and in each of these stages, there is a different process happening also from an environmental point of view. What we also understand the objective pursuit and discuss and exchange on solutions. Now, most of the measures that we're talking about will have some sort of what we call in jargon the PPMs, and the product-related production methods. They should be based on international standards and have a global purpose. After all, we're dealing with global challenges. In some cases, there are no international standards, but still you can find ways to at least build on existing standards. And we should then in parallel develop a strategy to develop international standards. And of course, last but not least, measures should meet all WTO legal requirements. I'll leave it at this, and I am happy to take questions now or later. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was really the best expose I have heard during last months about consistency of EU Green Deal policy with the WTO rules or problems which may appear here, and certainly we have already some questions. If you allow me to put a question from my side to you. In practical terms, our businesses are, I would say, not slightly worried about possible changes in market access terms in case all measures, as they have heard, will be implemented. They are speaking about coal, fertilizers, natural gas, and other products. And similar problems we see by other suppliers from other countries. Look, what would be your advice to those industries? I mean, certainly they would like to continue trade, and certainly they would like to continue generation of profit. What you expect them to do, or you advise them to do in order to be in a safe zone? That's my question. A question from the audience is, I will read it. Dr. Tuninger, thank you very much for your presentation. I would like to ask a question about tropical deforestation. As I know, the EU is one of the world's largest importers of tropical deforestation and the carbon emissions associated with it after China. So my question is whether Green Deal is dealing with this problem, or it is another sphere of regulation and discussion. Thank you very much. Mr. Karatin from HSE from university. So these two, if possible, these two questions.
Yeah, maybe to have a deviation to another area. So I'll start with deforestation. And I can confirm, yes, so the EU Green Deal includes a biodiversity package. And as part of that, there are plans for deforestation. And at this moment, we are working on legislation for deforestation. You know that at this moment, we have a so-called timber regulation in place that deals with illegal logging. As defined in third countries, and we are now moving to a system that would be based on the definition of sustainability criteria. So it goes beyond only illegal logging. It applies undiscriminatory, so both to EU products and imported products. So from that perspective, that will also apply to the EU, whether we are big consumers or others. Fact is that there's a recognition that we need to take that, we need to address that. It is not only the measure we are looking at, there is also a development of forestry partnerships to go in parallel and hand in hand to accompany the legislation. And in addition to that, because we are talking about quite a number of countries that are least developed countries, there will also be capacity building dimensions to that. Now, what I can advise to business, well, my first comment would be, it is not new what we say. The Green Deal has been announced since quite some time. And the second point is that it depends, of course, on the type of measures that you take. If we go, one of the options under consideration is also, for example, excise duty. So that has a different dimension. But imagine that it is some sort of ETS, emission trading system. Individual companies will be able to deduct their climate efforts, if you want, their carbon emissions. They will be able to deduct that. And it will be in one or another way when they export to the EU. So in that way, the climate burden, if you are a climate good performer in climate, that is to be taken into account, because otherwise we also come into issues on discrimination. But I would recommend prepare. And of course, ultimately, this is also what was announced when we made the Green Deal. If countries would all have high ambitions for climate, ultimately one would not need border measures. So it is also important that the climate measures are stepped up, and we have that opportunity on our way to COP26.
Thank you very much. And we have a possible last question to you. Paulina Tonkich, she's from the Center of Expertise and also from HE's University. Please, Paulina.
Thanks, Maxime, and Dr. Tuininga, thank you very much for your presentation on one of the most contentious issues in the WTO these days. So my question is, implementing environmental measures would obviously require additional support provided to the industries in their shift towards greener policies. So this would probably be relevant for both industrial and agricultural subsidies, thus both the SCM and the agriculture agreements. So in your view, how these subsidies would fit into the WTO framework and the WTO agreements, and do you think they may actually increase the currently applied levels of support? And I thank you very much in advance.
I mean, this is something that we are looking at, definitely. We have now, for the time being, we have put a bit of a focus on fossil fuel subsidies. I will not hide that it is very sensitive. There's a political commitment from the EU to eliminate them. But when you get to the nitty-gritty and the transition in which we are transitioning to it, it is sensitive. So we will need to see with it. I think my short answer would be there is definitely a legal dimension to it. There are subsidies that are simply illegal and not. But I think we're also entering into an area that we are thinking, what does make sense? Do we want to continue to subsidize the biggest emitter to climate? So that gets you into a different type of area. And this is why I always emphasize you cannot separate trade and environment. We have to, I mean, in the end of the day, you can send us on a domestic measure to a good set of WTO lawyers to defend whether it was justified or not. But if you do not understand the underlying objective of what you try to achieve and do not have some sort of common understanding that is the global purpose, down the road it will become very difficult. And I do think that we have a responsibility to reflect in the WTO and think on how can we accompany this process in a way that trade also contributes to that.
Thank you very much. And what we hope, Madeleine, that at some point when we will fight pandemic and all flights will come back and you will be able to visit our university and to see us in person. And I think we will have a very interesting discussion on all current and future elements of environmental policies, whatever it will be in WTO, in the European Union, or in Russia. So thank you very much. And Paulina?
Thank you, Maxime, and good morning, dear colleagues. Since it's the first time I formally take the floor today, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to take part in the event, and it is a real pleasure. Our next speaker will be Ms. Ekaterina Mayorova, who you all know very well, Russia's chief trade negotiator, responsible for the country's strategy in the WTO. Ekaterina will address one of the most topical issues in the multilateral trading system these days and will share with us the views from Moscow on the WTO reform. Indeed, the current challenges in the multilateral trading system reflect the pressing need for reforms in the WTO. Revitalizing the system is also in Russia's best interests, I may say, taking into account that over 80% of the country's trade structure is covered almost exclusively by the WTO agreements. Therefore, any hints on how to improve the WTO system, possible points of convergence, and ways to resolve the current crisis could be of help. So, Ekaterina, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Paulina. Thank you for the introduction. And I was very glad to see all distinguished speakers. It was a long time we haven't seen each other. It was a big pleasure. Hope to continue these enormously pleasant and interesting discussions further. As to my topic, yes, truly, the need to reform the WTO was recognized at the highest political level yet in 2018 in Buenos Aires by almost all key members. At that time, G20 leaders have set respective tasks to their trade ministers and trade experts. This happened against the backdrop of a noticeable disruption in the WTO functioning. And these disruptions almost paralyzed main functions of the organization. At the end of the last decade, multilateral negotiations on new trade agreements, or so-called Doha round negotiations, actually stalled. Since the end of 2019, the dispute settlement system has become, in fact, non-operational because of the appellate body crisis. And these problems were aggravated by imperfect monitoring mechanisms, respective tools aimed to control the implementation of obligations by members proved to be not effective enough. Nevertheless, despite a bit pathetic connotation of the term reform, this process itself is quite ordinary and naturally occurring. It is rather natural to seek for institutional improvements of the organization when there are obvious gaps that impede its effective functioning. It is also natural to expect the evolution of its agenda in case if new areas of trade that obviously require universal rules are not yet covered by the WTO law. Everyone understands the necessity of the reform, though people are putting into this word different meanings. The thing is that the WTO members identify the problems depending on their own interests and on their own economic conditions. For example, some consider it unfair when certain large economies are granted with the right to enjoy benefits of a special and differential treatment, and thus call for a revision of this special and differential treatment. Others, in fact, those who enjoy this treatment, on the contrary, do not want to lose their preferences and continue to claim that the interests of developing countries shall remain at the heart of the entire WTO agenda, and that the right to the special and differential treatment is something unshakable. One may notice a very rich palette of opinions around almost all trade topics. Still common is, however, the agreement that there is no alternative to the WTO, for the moment at least. Such agreement is one of the keys to success, in my view. Another key is the recognition of the fact that sort of a cherry-picking approach, when one addresses only those problems that he wants to see, is inappropriate. Ignoring or postponing the problems that part of the membership considers vital will hardly work. Let me say a couple of words about the problems that we believe require an urgent solution. Obviously, it is necessary to revise the rules created between 1947 and mid-90s, when the WTO was actually born. The rules are already lagging behind the current economic realities. And best example here is e-commerce, where we need to agree upon common regulatory principles and form an adequate global environment. The acceleration of digitalization increases the risks that need to be properly dealt with. For example, in respect of protection of users, in respect of protection of consumers, new illicit practices, or like issues related to access to internet, for instance. Now, in some areas, acceded countries, acceded members like Russia, for instance, and others, became pioneers that successfully tested the new approaches and advanced standards, advanced as compared to common WTO rulebook. This is true, for instance, for services domestic regulation and partly for investment facilitation. And our example proves that those are the areas where modernization of the current rulebook may be, first of all, easy, And secondly, beneficial, first of all, for the domestic business community, as it allows to reduce costs and increase competitiveness of the whole economy. So here we see another area where WTO membership might reach good progress in reforming current WTO rule. Since the landscape of world trade has significantly changed and major shifts in the distribution of added value within the global production chains have taken place, there are new challenges for competition in the world market. Among those challenges, I would mention sophisticated forms of trade distorting support in sectors of industry, which is what US, EU, and Japan, so-called Troika members, focus on, but also in agriculture. Now we can see the competition distorting activities of transnational companies, transnational giants, or the artificial obstacles for technology flows and thus for technological development. For instance, the access to technology is not regulated by multilateral agreements, and this creates an additional temptation for right holders to monopolize respective value chains in order to extract additional profits and strengthen technological leadership. Governments, in turn, use existing exemptions from the WTO rules to restrict the transfer of technology as part of goods or services, but such exceptions, which are used for justification, are quite vague. So those are examples of either clear gaps or at least gray areas in the WTO law that, in our view, need to be filled. I certainly have to mention a green component in trade issues, which is now evolving, and Madeleine made an exceptional presentation as to how this green policy may fit into the WTO. I'm pretty sure we will inevitably have discussions on that later on in different forums. Our concern here is that new forms of protectionism are emerging. We can observe the emergence of these trends not only using climate reasoning, but also using national security, for instance, reasoning as an excuse for trade restricting practices which are, to put it mildly, questionable, at least questionable from the WTO perspective. And we see our task in ensuring that the WTO principles are not eroded by these new forms of protectionism and competitive distortions. And the goal is to reduce the risks of decreasing competitiveness and to prevent technological isolation. At the same time, it is necessary to ensure that all players in the world trade arena follow the rules and fulfill their existing obligations. It would make no sense to create new rules if such rules would not be complied with. Therefore, of course, an essential pillar of the WTO reform is related to the restoration of a full functioning dispute settlement system and the resolution of the appellate body crisis. Another important element, which became very famous recently, is related to strengthening of transparency and notification obligations and disciplines, with a view to ensure efficient control over the WTO compliance. I think combining efforts in the areas that I mentioned within the WTO reform will promote stable and predictable conditions for participation of economic operators in international trade. And this is especially important in the light of global tasks to restore the world economy from the consequences of the pandemic. such efforts could also determine the speed of economic recovery, both at national and international level. And I think all members, without exceptions, need such trade and such economic stability, and this reduces the possibility of a bad scenario in respect of the WTO reform. Thank you very much.
Sorry, thank you very much, Katerina, for such an insightful presentation. I suppose our distinguished audience may have quite a number of questions in this regard, but I will kindly ask for their patience until after our next presentation. I'm now pleased to move to our next speaker, who is with us today from Geneva. His Excellency, Mr. Dmitry Lakishev, head of the Russian mission to the WTO. Universality and consensus, some of the key principles underlying the multilateral trading system, are the ones that give the system its strength, but are also the ones that have, over time, led to some serious difficulties in the WTO system, including various decision-making issues and operational challenges. So, as they say in Russia, life is more complicated than our schemes, or жизнь сложнее наших схем. So the WTO life turned out to be more complicated than was originally envisaged, and it became more and more costly to conform to the single undertaking and consensus principles in the WTO. And in turn, the ideas of shifting towards plurilateral formats have started to proliferate, giving rise to questions as to whether they are the building blocks or the stumbling blocks for the multilateral trading system. So Dmitry Lakishev will be talking about the prospects of the plurilateral initiatives in the WTO and what is the systemic and commercial logic behind such formats. Ambassador, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Polina. I would like to share my screen for the presentation, if you allow.
We can see the presentation now.
Okay, very good. Indeed, at the eve of the long-awaited 12th WTO Ministerial Conference, the discussion around plurilateral agreements and their incorporation into the WTO has become one of the central topics here in Geneva. Polina, you made an excellent introduction into the ideas of my presentation, so I'll go directly to the points. Today, I would like first to give you a brief overview of the history of plurilateral agreements and of the legal aspects of their introduction into the WTO. Second, report the current situation in Geneva and Russia's approach. And finally, try to forecast future developments. Indeed, the agreements with a limited number of participants are quite an important part of the history of GATT and WTO. In fact, several WTO agreements of the Uruguay round originated from PAs, and their evolution lasted for many years, even decades. An illustrative case is the anti-dumping agreement, which was born in 1960s within Kennedy round of GATT negotiations as the first anti-dumping code. And it took nearly 30 years to take all the GATT membership on board. Some other important elements of the WTO system, for example, TBT, subsidies, rules of origin, import licensing agreement, experienced the same evolution. Regulation of trade in textiles is another interesting case. The GATT-era plurilateral multi-fiber arrangement, which provided for bilateral deals on import quotas as well as for unilateral restrictive measures by importers, was replaced by the Uruguay round by the multilateral agreement on textiles. The latter established a 10 years transitional period for phasing out those exceptions from the normal GATT rules in the textile sector, and then terminated. It so happened, however, that some PAs of the old GATT could not gather enough support in the Uruguay round to be transformed into multilateral agreements within the WTO. Thus, 4 of them were legalized in the WTO Special Annex 4 to the Marrakesh Agreement, specifically created for the lawful plurilateral deals. Then their fate was different. 2 plurilaterals, GPA, Government Procurement Agreement, and Civil Aircraft Agreement, survived until today. They are administered by the formal WTO bodies, but are still far away from being transformed into multilateral deals.
Ambassador, apologies. We still have the first slide for some reason on our screens. Could you kindly check? Yes. So here we go. Here we go. Now it moves.
Now?
Yes, we can see the 4th slide.
Okay.
Now, thank you.
The Government Procurement Agreement now comprises just 21 participants plus 27 individual EU members, and 11 more are formally in the process of accession. The modest expansion of the GPA has been mostly fueled, evidently, by the commitments taken by the new WTO members upon the accession to the WTO. And in many cases, the process of accession to the GPA is not quite rapid. Georgia and Kyrgyzstan are in this process for 22 years, since 1999, China since 2002, and Russia since 2013. And most of big developing WTO members, which are not bound by the accession commitments, express few enthusiasm about joining GPA, with the only exception of Brazil, which autonomously launched accession process in 2017. Thus, GPA evidently doesn't have clear perspectives to reach a critical mass of members and become a multilateral deal. The same can be said about Civil Aircraft Agreement, which was signed long before the Marrakesh Agreement in 1980, but until now unites just 32 participants, major aircraft producers, plus some Article 12 members bound by their accession commitments. Meanwhile, the tariff commitments in the CA of the CA participants were incorporated in their tariff schedules, and so did many other WTO members without formally joining CA. And its rules part was covered by the agreement on subsidies and the GPA. It's worth to add that the systemic meaning of the CA was to much extent compromised by the long-lasting battles of 2 main global players in that sector, Boeing and Airbus, in the dispute settlement body of the WTO. 2 other documents of the Annex 4 to Marrakesh Agreement, plurilateral bovine meat agreement and dairy agreement, were scrapped at the end of 1997, when the participants admitted that the trade in those sectors could be better handled under the agriculture and SPS WTO agreements. Thus, most of the PAs which existed in the old GATT either were transformed into the multilateral agreements in the Uruguay round, or were contained in Annex 4, or just ceased to exist. Since the Uruguay round, there have been also some successful examples of incorporation of plurilateral arrangements into the WTO system. Just to check, is it the presentation goes okay now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Those are Information Technology Agreement, the commitments of its participants covering more than 97% of global trade in IT goods were gradually incorporated into their tariff schedules. And the arrangements on telecommunication and financial services, which found their places in the WTO as additional protocols to the GATT. The current acceleration of plurilateral processes in the WTO is partially linked with poor multilateral results of the most recent 11th Ministerial Conference in 2017. On that background, most active and systemically thinking members signed joint ministerial statements launching 4 plurilateral tracks. On domestic regulation and services, on investment facilitation, on support of micro, small and medium enterprise, and on e-commerce. Now, 3.5 years later, the work on these tracks is more active than activities of the dedicated formal WTO working bodies, like working group on services or working program on e-commerce. More than 100 out of 164 WTO members participate in one or more GSIs, and Russia is active participant of all 4 of them. And the work of this format already produced some tangible results. Inspired by this success, a group of ecological activists within the WTO are keen to transform the discussion on trade aspects of environmental policies into another plurilateral track. These so-called structured discussions on trade and environmental sustainability were launched in March this year with a quite broad tentative agenda, and Madeleine gave an extensive presentation on this activity. Another example is the Trade and Health initiative described by Ambassador Shambhavi. However, it's still questionable whether these efforts can compensate the lack of progress on the multilateral tracks. Most importantly, there is the issue of critical mass. Remember the fate of GPA and civil aircraft agreements. 100 members is a nice number, but if such elephants as India or the United States or the community of African countries are out, the process lacks universality. The perception that the non-participating members can join at a later stage may not work, especially in the situation when those who decline to join are not silent. Now, in fact, a group of developing countries led by India and South Africa formed a strong and voicey opposition to the substitution of the multilateral process by plurilateral initiatives. Those opponents shoot at another weak point of the plurilateral process, claiming that until the agreement is adopted by consensus of the WTO membership, it cannot be accommodated in the WTO legal system. Why there is such a strong opposition to the plurilaterals? In fact, it unites members who feel themselves deceived in the WTO at least twice. In the Uruguay round, they received less than expected and were promised that the new negotiating round would have the development issues at its core. Then, when Doha round failed, they felt that the new GSIs left behind the centrality of the idea to modernize the WTO system in favor of developing countries. Interestingly, the domestic policies of India and the others, in fact, do not much deviate from the goals of GSIs. For example, in the area of supporting integration of SMEs into the international trade. India should also be objectively interested in developing fair and universal rules of e-commerce. Thus, it seems that the opposition is fueled rather by horizontal and philosophical considerations than by pragmatic or commercial ones. Are they right in their claims about illegality of plurilateral talks, and does their legal analysis reflect correctly all options of introducing PAs in the WTO? Those options may be different depending on the subject of the agreements. In particular, it's important to determine whether those agreements create new sets of trading rules or advanced market access commitments of the members. However, PAs can contain elements of both categories. So I drew a red line on this scheme. And of course, agreements reached at regional level are quite a specific case. So the easiest way for to incorporate PAs into WTO is through amendments to the members' individual commitments, according to the procedure specified in GATT and GATS. In case of domestic regulation and services, there are also specific provisions in GATS Article 6, which provide Council for Trade in Goods with the authority to develop relevant disciplines. However, this avenue generally is not suitable for agreements establishing new trade rules and disciplines. One of the reasons is unclearness about applicability of MFN principle towards rules. It should also be taken into account that procedures of certifications or certification of new commitments will not be finalized if any of other WTO members raises objections. The Article 10 of Marrakesh Agreement provides for detailed procedure for amending itself or any of the agreements, including in its annexes. And in some instances, even the consensus is not formally required. However, the WTO carefully avoids any precedent of voting. A new agreement should also pass the so-called Article 3.2 test. Members should admit that it fits the general scope of the organization. Pluridissidents, as we call them, have some doubts in this regard, for example, on investment facilitation initiative. The same Article 10 contains a procedure of incorporating a new agreement into the WTO system as a plurilateral one, just adding it to Annex 4. That option, however, doesn't allow to reach the goal of multilateralization of new disciplines. And besides, it needs membership's consensus, difficult to be reached in the current circumstances. Members can agree on changing these rules, but again, only by consensus. To make the list of options full, we should also take note of the procedure for RTAs. Formally, those are also agreements between limited number of WTO members through their notification and further review at the WTO. Nevertheless, this procedure ensures compatibility of the new agreements with the WTO system, but does not incorporate them into the rulebook, thus keeping isolated from the WTO. Although using them as a testing ground for new rules is quite a common practice among the members. Thus, there are several options for plurilaterals, but all of them have limitations. Evidently, the only universal way is the traditional one, to obtain from the Ministerial Conference a mandate to develop a new agreement, to ensure full membership's engagement, and then adopt the new agreement at another Ministerial Conference. The fact that during 25 years of the existence of the WTO, only one large-scale agreement, the Trade Facilitation Agreement, successfully passed that way, raises serious doubts about the efficiency and practicability of this procedure. Meanwhile, there is a growing risk that the new plurilateral agreements designed as a laboratory for the modernized WTO rules may transform into an obstacle to the reform. The non-participants would continue to oppose their incorporation into the WTO and thus protract the reform in a whole. These pessimistic thoughts may bring you to the question, why does Russia invest into GSI negotiations? There are several reasons for that. First, systemically, we are interested in keeping the WTO afloat. This can be done only if the body keeps its relevance through its reform. And of course, the alternative to the rules-based system is a jungle where the right of mighty prevails. Second, we have our own views and commercial interests in these areas, which are subject to the new negotiations, and we are trying to incorporate them into the new rules. If we abstain from the process, the new rules will be written without us. Third, as Ekaterina said, upon accession, Russia undertook advanced commitments, which are now discussed as a part of general disciplines, which may be spread on other WTO members within the new agreements, as it is in case with domestic regulation and services. Are there any perspectives in spite of the difficulties that I described? What may be the way ahead? I see two scenarios. In the first one, the co-sponsors of the APAs eventually will manage to wrap up their new agreements and then will approach to the dissidents. This is, in fact, the scenario of the Tokyo and Uruguay rounds. And now it is more difficult, but in my view, not helpless. When the Plari fans will have finished products, their position will be stronger than now. And the most evident tactics will be selling the new deals to the opponents in exchange of their consent on some other elements of the WTO agenda, for example, agriculture or softer stance on SDT reform. So trying to converge the single undertaking to the most possible extent. If the first scenario fails, the new rules and disciplines will inevitably go outside the WTO. This scenario, of course, means disaster for the multilateral system in terms of its further fragmentation and loss of relevance. Hopefully, this will not happen. Colleagues, it's a very broad and rich topic. I think I already is out of the time limit. Wrapping up, I would like to stress that the issue of trade policy geometry evidently is now one of the most tempting area for both academic researchers and practicing negotiators. And I wish all success to those of you who is keen to further elaborate on it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for such an interesting presentation. And I guess our session turned out to be so interesting that we need to prolong the session by about 15 minutes, if you allow us. And I'm glad we can now move to the Q&A session. I will take the questions in the order of their arrival. The first question came from Grigory Kalachigin from the Higher School of Economics, Center for European and International Studies. Dr. Mayorova, I will read the question for the convenience of the audience. Thank you very much for your presentation, Dr. Mayorova. I have two questions concerning some aspects of the WTO reform. First, is it possible to be completed at least partly by MC12? In which spheres can it be? Could China and the US make consensus, or their political controversy make it impossible? Second, as for the dispute settlement process, we know the appellate body is in collapse. However, there is a temporary instrument in BIA. Russia does not take part in it, and there were no public statements concerning why it does so. But I would like to ask why, in your opinion, other countries do not join in BIA. Is that because they are concerned it will hamper reform of the dispute settlement, or are there any other reasons? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the questions. I'll start with the first one about the perspectives of MC12 in December, which hopefully will take place this December in the end. There was a long tradition in the WTO to solve different elements as a part of a single undertaking. And it is very difficult to break this tradition, to pick up a low-hanging fruit and to do and finalize and conclude what can be concluded realistically. Because people normally tend to link things to each other, introduce their own interests, their own requests on the negotiating table, and by the time of decision making, it becomes a sort of spaghetti ball, if I can use this term here. So this complication definitely will continue to exist this year as well. But I still think that some room for progress by December is available, I don't think that there will be big elements like new agreements, even within the framework of these joint statement initiatives in plurilateral format. The best candidate is a fishery subsidies agreement, but we'll see how the situation will evolve by the end of the year. So far, the discussions are moving very slow and very difficult. So we'll see. Our own experience of WTO accession and our later experience as WTO members on a number of ministerial conferences, which also were not easy, shows that even in hopeless situation, the end or the light in the end of the tunnel still there, and some progress can be reached. So I hope we'll manage to get something to show to all of us that WTO is still alive. On MPIA and PIA, the reasoning of different members is different. I heard from some delegations, I heard the view that simply they do not have disputes with those members who participate in this initiative, and therefore they are not interested in signing up to it. Another logic which I also heard and which I personally share to some extent is that we do not have to focus our efforts on some parallel things. We have to rather focus on the main problem and to try to find a compromise on appellate body and to restore multilateral system rather than a plurilateral mechanism. So this logic is also something very, very common in Geneva. I think those are, probably the main arguments I've heard from those who opted not to participate in MPIA. But anyway, this is an open, as I understand, an open option. So if the situation changes anytime, any member may join. Thank you.
Thanks, Ekaterina, for such a comprehensive reply. The next two questions go to His Excellency Mr. Dmitry Lakishev. So the first question is from the mission of Uzbekistan. Good morning, many thanks for the presentation. I have one question. What is perspective of reaching an agreement or agreements on the GCIs during MC12? And the second question, if I may, put both of them right now. The second question from Grigory from the High School of Economics. Dr. Lakishev, thank you very much for the presentation. I have a question about the point of incorporating plurilateral agreements through RTA process. If I may, how it will correspond to the requirement that RTAs should cover substantially all trade? And thank you in advance. Ambassador? Could you take the two questions, please?
Thank you, and thank you very much for the questions. On GSIs, indeed, they are now in different shape and in different stages of their process, and their expectations on their completion by MC12 are different. The initiative on domestic regulation and services is nearly completed, and it has very good chances to be formalized, at least on the margins of MC12 as a plurilateral initiative. There are one precondition for that. All participating members should present their draft schedules of commitments, and those schedules should be examined by the other co-sponsors. And what is systemically more important, it is expected that the United States may change their stance and to join formally into the initiative. There are some signals from the new U.S. administration that hasn't happened yet. Maybe it will happen in the coming months. And of course, this will be a strong stimulus for finalization of the negotiations in the whole. On other GSIs, on MSMEs, we already reached some arrangements in December last year. So that's sort of work in progress. We, by MC12, evidently will fix where we are, what sort of recommendation for the governments we have elaborated, and draw the prospects for further work. On e-commerce, we just have some blocks of the new agreement, and for MC12, it's again about fixing the progress achieved. And the same about investment facilitation, I would say. It's more advanced, but I don't think that it will be finalized by MC12. On the next question by Grigory Kalachigin, thank you very much. Grigory hit the right point. In fact, the sectoral plurilateral arrangements are not at all the classical RTAs within the understanding of the WTO. They indeed have a few chances to pass the test of trade coverage. But that doesn't matter much because, as I tried to explain, the procedure of making RTAs compatible with the WTO doesn't allow to incorporate them into the WTO law. Still, the RTAs, if they are presented as regional agreements, they stay aside from the system and have no chance to become part of the rulebook. That also has some risk of fragmentation of the system if the new rules, disciplines, and market success arrangements between a limited number of members will go into regional integration process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dmitry. And we've got one more question, probably the last one, from Olga Ponizova from Eco Accord. Does Russia take part in trade and environment initiatives in the WTO? And trade and environmental substantiality structured discussions in the WTO? Yekaterina, could I kindly ask you to maybe respond to that question quickly?
Yes, thank you, Paulina. We certainly are looking very closely to the structured discussions and the topic raised in this fora, because obviously those are the topic which have a very direct, might have a very direct implication to the Russian exports. I think our main focus now in this environmental and trade related area is the Green Deal of the European Union generally, and this carbon tax, or CBAM, specifically. We are monitoring what's happening with the policy of our biggest trading partner, and well, for the moment, waiting, but at some point, of course, we'll start a discussion as regards the compliance of different measures with the WTO rules, because it's not a secret that we are far not sure that the mechanism, the CBAM, and some other elements of Green Deal in other areas, like in agriculture, for example, and in some industrial sectors as well, in energy sector, that all measures will be WTO consistent. So we think we have potentially a big scope for disagreement here with the European Union. Thank you.
Thanks, Katerina, and I would like to pass the floor back to my co-moderator, Maxim Medvedkov, for wrapping up this session. Maxim, please.
Thank you very much, Paulina. Colleagues, my personal opinion is that for me it was a really interesting, very interesting reports, very interesting discussion, and I thank all speakers and all participants for their contributions. I would like to remind those who is interested in trade policy that our second part of our conference will take place on 27th of April. It's about report on effects of Eurasian integration. So those who are interested could register at our site of Institute of Trade Policy of Higher School of Economics. And finally, as we announced, the record of today's discussion is on YouTube. And totally, we have registered more than 70 people who participated either directly or through YouTube in that seminar. Thank you very much, and see you at our next sessions, meetings, and discussions on trade policy. Thank you very much again, and bye.
Thanks, colleagues.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and bye-bye. It was good to see you all.
Thank you very much.
Have a good day.